Thank you very much, Porter. And yeah, I usually introduce myself, if I haven't already, to one of you as a social science girl in a natural science world. So what that means really is that I'm trained in the methods and theories of social science, but I really find my joy and spend my time working with people like you, with natural scientists. So imagine my excitement to be here today at WHOI. This is one of the epicenters of discovery and communication about the deep ocean. And today I want to invite you on a whistle-stop tour through my dissertation work. And I want to think together about how we can improve the positive impact of our science by taking seriously the governing role that we currently play in the Ocean Twilight Zone. So I have three key ideas. I'm going to give you all the spoilers up front. In the next 20 minutes, I want to convince you of these three things. First, that scientists are powerful in ocean management. Especially when we may feel unheard in political debates, it can be really difficult to believe this, but here now in the Ocean Twilight Zone, we're leading the conversation. Second, I want to show you that this governing role begins with the everyday work that we perform on our research vessels. And I want to propose a way that we can together reflect on how we do this work and how we might be able to collectively improve it. And finally, I want to remind you of the importance of maintaining the legitimacy of science. We're all here because we care about the ocean. We all want our work to be taken seriously. But the human activity in the Ocean Twilight Zone will inevitably bring contestation. I want to talk about how we can prepare for that contestation. So how do I start my story? In social science departments and at social science conferences, I show the nice stratified picture of the ocean. I show some of the nice pictures about the animals that live in the Ocean Twilight Zone. But here I'm going to show you this picture. What do you see when you look at this? Your first reaction might be, wait, did I show up at the wrong meeting? Why are we looking at rocks? But if you recognize that layer in the middle, you might see that it's a coal seam. And what you see when you look at this, whether you identify it as a coal seam or not, depends on your social and political knowledge. Other people might look at this and see an opportunity for profit and money making. And others might see a volatile material that needs to stay exactly where it is, lest it cause even more damage to our planet. So with this, I hope you see the analogy, right, with the other layer. I want to say that natural resources, just like fossil fuels, they're not mutually existing awaiting discovery, but rather they're constructed by these social and political processes that discover and anticipate the benefits of the natural world for our human systems. And as scientists, we play a role in that process. What might begin as an apolitical technical discovery can very rapidly have real political and social consequences. So colleagues of mine from Wageningen University have shown that authoritative assessments produced by scientists can actually shape the way that the political debate happens. And they've done this with climate change. So we give structure and vocabulary to what the public and the politicians are eventually talking about. And these structures have consequences. So simply by pondering what's down there, if we go deeper, what will we catch? I wonder if we can eat it. Can very quickly move the governance debate into questions of how might we catch it? When will it be viable? Who's going to get started with this? And the point is that this will happen even if it's not our intention. The next thing I want to do, you'll recognize Alvin here. The next thing I want to say is that this matters a lot in the mesopelagic zone. Unlike forests or coastal ecosystems, ordinary people can't go there and make up their minds. I've got my PADI license, and someone's already made this joke with Larry going diving, but I can't get down to the mesopelagic zone either. And I want to have a quick show of hands. How many people in this room have ever actually seen the mesopelagic face to face? Okay, if I did that in any other auditorium. But consider yourselves part of a very, very small club on the planet. So these people here in this room are some of the few people who've been able to go there and come back with some stories. So even as a young specialist on the mesopelagic zone myself, I have to trust you guys, what you bring back. So what do we do with science? In my research, I really see that science is the orderly reduction of complexity. There's a vast dynamic ocean out there. And in the last few days, we've been talking about all the different methods we have to observe, quantify, and reduce some of this complexity into some meaningful and useful insight for ourselves and for policymakers. And the way that we do this influences the understanding that we have of that natural world. And I want to say that this is good empirical practice. But I also want to remind you that the way we reduce our complexity has implications. So we've seen this study a few times already this week from 2014, and it produced a number, 10 billion tons. And that number has traveled far beyond the publication. So you see it in other literature. It was also used to justify these big projects in the European Union. It, of course, shows up on the WHOI Oceanographic website. And it's also the leading tidbit in the project that funds my research. So this number of 10 billion tons, even though it came with a lot of caveats in the literature, it's traveled much further without those caveats attached. So in my research, I set out with a very simple question. I would have observed that there is this small community of gatekeepers of the ecosystem, and I wanted to know, what are we talking about when we're talking about this part of the world? So I'm a PhD student, so I'm humble. I started small. I collected every single abstract on this ecosystem, and I also collected every single tweet that's ever been made. So I used the keywords mesopelagic zone and ocean twilight zone, and I wanted to compare what was going on in the conversation. The very first insight I have, which shouldn't be a surprise to any of you, is that the number of documents being produced is growing quite rapidly. So I see this as a proxy for interest because we're being funded to do more of this work. But rather than just look through some of the examples, these are some of the things that I pulled out of there, the ideas that you might find in these different texts. Rather than doing that qualitatively, I wanted to do it with a model to see if I could really boil down all of this complex information to understand what it all comes out as. So there's me with my little research question. You don't have to read all of this. It's far too small to really understand. So for the sake of the talk, I'm just going to highlight a few things. The legend there shows whether a topic comes from Twitter or comes from science. And these topics here each represent a cluster of words. And those words represent a key central idea. So by example, this is topic 9. This came out, and you might recognize this more or less describes the session we're here to do today. So it's all about fish biomass distribution, even acoustic methods, and I expect some of the papers that you've published might have also been contributing to the establishment of this topic. And the color of the bar, of course, also shows that it's a predominantly scientific idea. It's something that exists mostly in the scientific abstract. And of course, here's an example of a paper that might have given some of the words to that topic. The second topic I'm going to highlight here is very blue, so you'll see it's from the website formerly known as Twitter. This is an unfortunate development in my research that now this data source has become rather controversial. But anyway, so you see that this is all about the large role that the mesopelagic zone plays in regulating carbon systems, diversity of the ecosystem, and perhaps if you read between the lines, there's a hint there at a new fishery in deep waters. And I'd like to also point out the last word there, California. That also represents that there's a regional bias to the type of work that's being done and that we're studying some places more than others. And here's also just to illustrate a tweet from right here, which was very exciting for me to be here because I've been studying what's been happening here and I get to see it now in person. So the next thing I wanted to do, okay, I have a nice overview of the literature with this topic model. Then I wanted to see how does it all fit together? Can we make a network out of this? So each of the nodes is one of the topics from the content, and then the connection shows the rate at which different words from these topics co-occur with others. So we start to develop a bit of a lay of the land, so to speak, of the conversation about the mesopelagic zone. And you can see that they aggregate in two clusters. One of them is all about fish, and the other is about the biogeochemistry. So again, I'm just going to highlight the two topics from the last slide. So you see here, this is where the second topic fits in, and there, that's where topic 9 fits in. So this figure more or less represents everything that's been done and said about the mesopelagic zone up until 2020 on Twitter and in science. Now, when I began this work, what I also wanted to do in that map was include policy. I wanted to show how does science speak to the public and how does policy pick up on that and how does it all fit together. I very quickly realized after gathering key ocean policy documents that actually I can't do that. It's not possible. There is no direct governance for the mesopelagic or ocean twilight zone. Instead, the mesopelagic zone is governed under existing policies. And of course, we'll hear a little bit later about the developments with BBNJ. But this means that we're sort of setting ourselves up for an ecosystem management now in scientists way before there's any policy that we're responding to. I didn't want to stop there. I took those 300,000 words of policy documents that I'd collected, and I used those 130 keywords from my topic model to see what hits do I get in the policy. And what you see there, the two most common words to come back are fish and fisheries. And the interpretation that I have of this is that the existing policy that we've had to manage our oceans has mostly been to manage the ocean in as far as it provides us fish for our fishing activity. Now we're going deeper into the ocean. We're finding that the ocean twilight zone has all of these other properties and characteristics. But at the moment, it looks as though we're just going to keep governing it as a resource of fish. So the overall conclusion I draw from this first part of my work is that, at least for now, we scientists are the de facto governors of the deep ocean. I was looking for alternative discourses on Twitter. I was looking for other ideas. But what I found actually was that scientists are just communicating their scientific work out to the public. And in this way, they're shaping what everybody knows up on the surface about the ecosystem. And thinking about what's outside of this scientific discourse, what's outside of our focus is also useful, I think. So for instance, a few papers have come out in the years since my data collection finished, but I didn't find any signal in the topic model that there was consideration about social and economic trade-offs. I know there's a few anecdotal ones, but social scientists are always criticized for talking in anecdotes, so I'm really sticking to what the model shows me. But essentially what it means is that the way we communicate our findings to the people who are there above the surface will really influence how this ecosystem is understood by the rest of the world. And how the ecosystem is understood by the rest of the world influences how it's going to be managed and governed and whether or not we can achieve sustainable management. So I hope this makes you realize that we have a lot of power in this moment. So understanding that these scientists are very powerful, I wanted to go and see science in action. I want to understand how this interpretation and translation is happening. Now, I'm not the first person to have this urge. Other people have studied science as a social practice before me. There's many people who've done it, but Bruno Latour, I'm not sure if you've heard of his work, he wrote a book called Laboratory Life, and he studied scientists as if they were a remote tribe somewhere else. And he saw, his key insight that he made was that the work that they're producing is really a product of the social systems that they operate within. So he started to challenge the idea that knowledge and data is collected, and he started to say that instead it's produced. It's a product of these social systems. And the contribution he made is that showing that these systems appear very mundane to someone who lives within them in the same way that water appears mundane to a fish. But as soon as Latour comes around and starts asking questions, you see that actually these things are very contingent on a lot of things that could be done otherwise. So taking inspiration from this, my aim is to understand scientific systems here in the mesopelagic zone. I want to know what effect they have on future governance, and I want to talk collectively and collaboratively on how we might change them to better achieve sustainability. So I strapped on my sea legs and I stowed away on a couple of research cruises. It was quite difficult to explain to the scientist in chief what it was that I was doing, but essentially I got my hands dirty, I made myself useful, I became familiar with all the equipment, the routines, the bodily sensations, and all of the meanings of being at sea and doing science. And while I was there, I wasn't an onboard psychologist and I wasn't looking at conflict or any of these other interesting things which do happen on research vessels. But rather, the unit of analysis that I took was activities. I was looking at what are the shared, collected, performed activities that we do. How do we learn this? How do we pass them on? And why might they matter for governance? So I found this fantastic illustration here, which shows a research vessel and all of the complicated things that happen in the different sites. And I see these places as being a home to very specific time and place bound practices. So in other words, things happen on research vessels that cannot happen anywhere else. And again, we're part of that very small club that's bringing back this information from the frontier. And these floating laboratories, just like other laboratories that have been studied in the past, they reflect the social realities of the things that are happening on land, the political funding situation, but also the wider knowledge regimes that they're contributing to. So what agency do we have as scientists in steering what's being produced? So I really want to look at the role of research vessels specifically in shaping mesopelagic zone governance. And this is the first concept diagram, but this is what it looks like. When you take a cruise, and maybe some of you will recognize some of this, but you start to break it down into practices and activities. We begin on land, there's lots of preparation practices, then there's a series of one-time orientation practices as we get started. This sets up routines, it establishes norms, it shows us how things should be done on the vessel with regards to safety, but also with regards to the science. And from then we settle into a routine and we start to repeat our movements from the dry lab to the wet lab to the deck and back again. We repeat this until we've told ourselves we've had a good enough data collection or we run out of time and money. And then we come back home and we start packing down and we start the other practices which continue on land. So from this overview, we can start to zoom in on some of these practices and see whether they might be consequential for the type of work we produce and how that might affect the governance of the deep ocean. So today, I just want to look closely at one practice. This is one of the cruises I observed, and the aim of this cruise was to test gear selectivity for mesopelagic fish by comparing 4 different cod ends. So because we were looking for differences in the four different designs for catching small target species of myctophids, the large animals were removed and discarded before the rest of the catch went down to the lab for processing. So I spoke with practitioners about what I'd observed, and they of course had a really good reason for what they did. And of course, at-sea scientists are sensible people, right? You're careful and you're considerate workers, but the quote here shows that habit and routine also play a large role in the practice. Making lives easier, making sure that there's standard procedure. Practitioners don't stop to think and just automatically do things. Now, I want to say that this is human. We all do this. Routine is absolutely crucial for everybody's day-to-day work. And on research vessels where time and space is limited, routine also helps us get the job done consistently and safely. However, when scientific practice becomes routine, the consequences of decisions that have been made long ago and that have been made without explicit consideration can mean that other animals are excluded from the data collection out of habit, and that's justified by the past practice. Okay, Amanda, so what? Cool, you've seen this. This was one time, one cruise. Why should I care about this in my research? Well, remember the context of what we've been talking about today. We have a big challenge ahead of us to try and understand this enormous ecosystem in a way that's reliable and sensible and useful. So it's useful for us, I think, to reflect on our work as a routinized practice and to see where we can maybe make some of these adjustments. Furthermore, especially in this case, we see that routinized practices embed some particular logic, some particular way of seeing the world. So because we were there to test the effectiveness of this gear on a target species, we were only looking for the target species, and that rendered this whole bucket of fish invisible from the data that we brought back with us. In addition, we also see the value of a social practice methodology. And again, I'm not singling out these scientists. This is something we all do. If you ask me my intention, I say I do yoga every single morning. That only happens 2 days a week. Here, you also see that in interviews, which is the standard methodology of social scientists, we go and ask people what they do and we interpret what they tell us. But by going there and actually watching what they do, you see that people say, hey, I'm here to collect as much data as possible. But when you observe the practice, you see that data is actually slipping through their fingers and going overboard. So sometimes it's not a matter of us not having the data, but it's just about us not seeing the data even when it's physically lying right in front of us. And I want to be absolutely clear here that my point is not that these are bad scientists, right? I respect how efficiently and effectively scientists work at sea and how difficult the conditions are. Rather, I just want to invite you to think along with me in practices to reveal an additional way that we might be able to adjust our work so that we can prepare for the different governance questions that are to come. So it will be necessary for us to adjust our scientific practices. And the breakout group that I was in yesterday, actually, we were already talking about the challenges of making the data that we collect interoperable so that we can actually share a global observation system for this enormous ecosystem. So I want to invite you as the experts of how this work is done at sea to think along with me about how we might be able to adapt what we do to get a more holistic picture, to improve our work, and to design more effective survey campaigns and more effective collaborations. So I hope you're still awake. I'm going to give you a quick overview. The story so far. Scientists for now are the de facto governors of the ocean. At least that's the story at the moment. And this governing role doesn't just begin with the text that we produce and the papers we publish and the tweets we make, but it actually begins with some of the decisions that we're making at sea. Next, I want to show you the limitations of this de facto governing role. We need to know what other stakeholders will want and think and value in order for any management strategy that we inform to be legitimate. If human activity in the mesopelagic zone becomes economically viable at some point in the future, other stakeholders will very quickly become involved and will need to be prepared to contribute to the debates that ensue. So I want to show you that as a community, even though we may not think that what we do is relevant for stakeholders, we can actually prepare for this debate that's coming by thinking about legitimacy. So here's again me with my research question. What about what everyone else thinks? So I know social science is powerful, but we can't predict the future. So in lieu of that, we looked at 3 analogous cases. So we tried to understand what's going on in deep sea mining at the moment. We looked at reduction fisheries, where we catch fish for fish feed and fish oil. And we looked at pulse fishing, which is a case that happened in the Netherlands. And the other thing we did was speak to stakeholders, and we listened to what they have to say. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to focus on just one of the case studies, and later I'll tell you what some of the stakeholders thought. So for those of you who are not familiar with electric pulse fishing, it was an improvement on a gear which has been used for a long time in the Netherlands. The North Sea is very shallow with a sandy substrate, so fishermen have been using beam trawl technology with heavy tickler chains to wake up fish from the seafloor where the benthic fish and catch them in their nets. Together with scientists, the industry developed an electric gear which would send small electric impulses through the water which would shock the fish without having to disturb the benthos so much, and which was actually more selective for the high-value flatfish that the fishermen were targeting in the first place. Because this gear is a lot lighter than dragging heavy chains, it also had a 50% reduction in the fuel that was being used. And because it wasn't making as much contact with the bottom, it was also improving the negative impacts it was having on the benthos. So if you look at this, this looks like a really positive development. Good technology, scientific stamp of approval. However, this technique didn't get social approval from society. The scientists maybe moved a little bit too quickly, the industry took it up too fast, the Dutch government gave too many licenses to the Dutch fishermen to move forward with this, and an NGO could very easily challenge the legitimacy of this with something that was not based in fact. This is not a flatfish, if you notice in the cartoon here that they're showing being electrocuted. But this challenge to the social license to operate of this fishing technique meant that it was banned. And so something that was quite economically and environmentally rational as an improvement on this fishing technique didn't make it past the parliament and wasn't implemented because of social challenges. So I hope you see now that this contestation is not just about facts. It's not about resolving uncertainty. Sometimes having more science communication and better communicating our facts and better telling people what the truth is not enough to make sure that something will be socially acceptable. And so what we do in the face of this realization is we start to look at this concept of legitimacy, which underlies a social license to operate. And we found a really useful framework, which essentially boils down, the paper's very long and very old, so rather than reading it, I can just show you, it boils down to this. Legitimacy comprises of interests, values, and worldviews. So these are things, interests refer to individual interests. So what a fisherman might get out of it, what a conservationist might get out of it, what's in it for me. The values is a moral argument. Is what we do socially acceptable or not? And the cognitive or worldview aspect is about, does this fit in the way that we've known the world? So that's a bit of a loftier concept, but it's basically the question of, is this even plausible to someone like me? And then we went and asked this question. And before I show you what the stakeholders thought, just a quick raise of hands. Does anybody think that fishing in the mesopelagic zone is a good idea? In this room? 0. Okay, interesting. So when we spoke to stakeholders, we got a different picture. We had a couple of people saying, look, this might be a good idea. There might be raw material for feed, which we've heard this argument already in this conference, right? This could be a really valuable resource to support aquaculture. We've also seen that doing so is the necessary act because we need to support food security. We have a growing population where we only get 3% of our food from the ocean. If we're fishing for swordfish and tuna, we should also be fishing for these guys. And finally, people said that the Ocean Twilight Zone can be managed with the existing fisheries management techniques that we have. Once we get a good enough stock assessment, we can establish MSY, we can put in a quota, and we can manage it the way we do our other stocks. But of course, there's plenty of people who disagree. And I think you might see now also that these answers, they align with the individual interests, with the moral justification for an activity, and with the cognitive worldview. And in the end, science can actually be used to support both answers. And of course, I know I can open up a big debate about how good that science might be and how it's being weaponized. But I really want you to understand that in the political arena, both groups can put forward this debate, and we need to be sure that we're supporting the one that we think is best. So at this point, some of you might be thinking, hang on a second, Amanda, I'm not a politician. It's really not my job to be making these decisions. But I want to say to you that we have a choice now. In our position as the de facto governors, we can either stick our head in the sand and deal with the contest when it comes to us, or we can get reflexive about our science. We can invite the contestation in, and we can start looking at what controversies might be on the horizon. We can engage with them in an anticipatory way, and then we don't miss our chance to be part of the debate, which is what happened in the Pulse example that I gave earlier. So I'm telling you that you have to do your science in an anticipatory way, so now I'm going to help you with some principles that I think are useful. So the first thing to do is consult early and consult often. So engaging with a wider community can really help us understand the foundations of an activity's legitimacy, even in an anticipatory way. So we were talking to stakeholders about the mesopelagic zone before they really knew if anything was going on. There was no commercial fishery to be supporting or opposing, but still you can get an idea of what people are going to think. Second of all, you have to take stakeholder perspective seriously. The pulse fishing case showed that scientists were really focusing on rational governance, best available science, but stakeholder perspectives were irreconcilable with that. And this might happen in the mesopelagic zone too. We may get stakeholder opinions that don't match what we think is legitimate, but they will be considered legitimate in the political arena. Third, don't be discouraged. Remember our authoritative position. Science still holds a lot of weight in society, so the importance of scientific advice should not be neglected. We are also stakeholders in the mesopelagic arena, but it's crucial to maintain our independent mechanisms for critique, rigor, and peer review. We should also be open to engaging other scientists beyond this community that we have here today to learn from them. And finally, of course, I'm going to say this, I'm a little bit biased, but during the project stakeholder meetings that we held, we really demonstrated that having social scientists on board who have the training and sensitivity to understand social concepts like legitimacy can help detect these conflicting perspectives in the room. So our natural science colleagues who were in the same space as us, listening to the same conversation, very quickly started unpacking scientific debates and seeing questions of fact. But having a social scientist there means you can also listen out for these interests, values, and worldviews that are really clear to be seen. And while I have the podium, I can't help but say here, social scientists do a lot more than science communication. So if you want to reach out and collaborate with social scientists, be really open that it's not just about convincing people of your facts, but that sometimes a social scientist can help you to understand what's going on in the outside world beyond your work. So a quick summary. It's our job as natural scientists to observe, count, describe, enumerate, and communicate the deep sea to policymakers and the public. Second of all, I accept that we already do this very rigorously, but I want to invite you to also be reflexive about the way we produce management-relevant data. I want us to open up more openly a conversation about how we produce this data and how we anticipate its relevance for policy debates while we're at sea. And finally, I want to say we should be informing the public, of course, but we should also be engaging with them and understanding what their concerns are and understanding how we might better serve them. After all, a lot of us are paid by taxpayers in the work that we do. So if any of you have been falling asleep or reading your emails during the last talk, I was really inspired by the talks about science communication. So I put it all into one snackable soundbite. So it all really boils down to this. As the de facto governors of the Ocean Twilight Zone, we have a responsibility and an opportunity to understand the interests, values, and worldviews of stakeholders so that we might produce science that can really support the decisions and trade-offs that are going to come in this ecosystem. So this work is still ongoing, so I really welcome your questions and comments, and I couldn't have done this without the enthusiasm and openness of the scientists who allowed me to observe them while they were observing the sea, and also to the stakeholders who came along to our workshops and spoke with us so openly. So I want to close by thanking them and also thanking you for your attention.
That's really was a wonderful talk. But as someone who worked with the orange roughy fishery, I would say, and who's involved with the science, I would say that to say that we're right now the de facto governors, that can change overnight. When I got involved with the orange roughy, the fishers took over they had the ear of the fisheries minister. They were, you know, their industry was important, far more important, contributed far more to the government than the scientists, it seemed. And so things can turn around very quickly. So I think you're right. We need to get involved, but also to just be prepared for the fact that, you know, that once the fishers, if they just really decide that that there's a resource there that's worth getting at, we might be run over very quickly. I guess that's more a comment than a question. But
thanks. But there's lots to learn from that example, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. It was a wonderful presentation. So I was curious. You emphasized the importance of the natural scientists in studying the mesopelagic zone. To me, there got to be some interaction between the profit-seeking industry as a driver, and then I think the scientists, you know, they're sort of curiosity-driven. So you have this long history studying the deep waters. That's curiosity-driven. But lately, because you have this potentially profit, you know, as you showed in the coal layer. So in your study, did you actually observed any of this sort of interaction, you know, in the you know, like analysis of words, right? And then what's your impression on the interactions, how important they are? Thank you.
Thanks, Jin. So on the question of within the text analysis, there was very little consideration of economics. Of course, that's a really clear question of whether or not this will be profitable. There was one paper from 2019 that ended up in the study, which has been really influential. I think anybody who has to talk about viability has to cite this paper because it's one of the only ones that was out there. There have been a few more that have come since my data collection in 2020, but it wasn't enough to show up as a topic in the analysis. So it may be there as a small part of the literature. But as you said, the majority of what we're doing is this so-called curiosity-driven work and this fundamental work. What we saw in the stakeholder consultations is that fishermen were coming along because they're curious what we're doing. So they're coming and they're listening as flies on the wall to see what is it that scientists are picking up. And that's why they're incentivized also to collaborate, because they're also looking for a frontier where they might also be able to make some money and go fishing. So that's, and one of the other anecdotal things I have, there was a paper published, I think, perhaps in the year 2000, I'll have to check the reference, and it was about the Patagonian toothfish fishery. And it's somewhere in the discussion or the conclusion of the paper, which was written by a natural scientist, where they make a small concession that perhaps maybe by going and exploring and being driven by curiosity, we may have opened the door to this fishery, even though it wasn't our intention. And it's a very small line in the paper, and I'd have to check with the author if that was the intention. But I think that's what I want to open up in the discussion here today is that possibly what we are doing inadvertently? That by going in a curiosity-driven way and not understanding that the fishermen are also watching over our shoulder or not taking preemptive action, we open ourselves to the same disaster of the orange roughy fishery, to the same thing as Patagonian toothfish. And here, uniquely, we have the chance to act in a more anticipatory, preemptive way.
Thanks, Amanda. Your point about stakeholder perspectives is very well made, but of course, the flip side of that is, and we've heard a lot about it this week, is ocean literacy. And so do you see there's a role for, if you like, scientific lobbyists to go out there and try and fill that sort of void between the shortcomings in some cases of the stakeholder perspective versus the uptake of ocean literacy?
Thanks. It's a really good question. It makes me think carefully. Ocean literacy is not really my field, so don't take me as an authority on it. But my perspective is, I think telling people facts is only one thing. We talk to people about the dangers of smoking, and people still smoke. And eventually they gradually change their mind. But there needs to be an information campaign and an action campaign. And one of the challenges that I see for ocean literacy is you can show people the sea and you can show people some of the challenges or some of the issues. But taking that next step to call them to action, to change who they vote for, to lobby their local government for some management action, that's something that really I think we can improve a lot on. So making the connection between just knowing and understanding something and then doing something better is, I think, there's a lot of room for improvement there in ocean literacy stuff. I don't know, someone was joking in the poster session, getting a tattoo of a strawberry squid is really nice, but does that change who you vote for in the next election? And does that change how the policymakers? I think it's about getting not just ocean literacy, but ocean citizenship. And then we really start to see action.
Thanks, Amanda. That was terrific. Just a question in case you're needing more research issues to investigate. Probably not, but the Central Arctic Ocean High Seas Fisheries Agreement could be worth looking at in terms of what drove the decision of these governments, both the Arctic bordering countries as well as China and the European Union, to commit to basically a 16-year freeze on fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean, and developed a sort of at least committed to developing a science action plan to pursue the questions that would need to be answered before launching a commercial scale fishery. Have you had a chance to look at that, and do you have any perspectives yet?
Very honestly, I have not, but I guess there's a lot we could learn. That could be a successful case, a so-called bright spot that we could hold up where science has really had the desired effect. I think we've been ignored with climate change, we're ignored with vaccines, we're ignored so often. So perhaps there is scope for a paper to look at the bright spots of when did we get what we want. I was really surprised by the reaction in the room that no one here thinks that fishing the mesopelagic zone is a good idea. And the fact that after being here for 2 days, that was a surprise to me, I think that shows something about our communication and that we're quite reserved in showing what we really think. So perhaps we can be a bit more bold in saying what our scientific opinion is, because we are the ones who are most informed about this. I hope this isn't a hurricane evacuation.
No, we just have an online question that I can't see, so I'm going to go read it on Matt's computer.
I think we can save remaining questions for the panel, and give another thanks to Amanda for her excellent talk.